drill we're going to work on this morning and tomorrow morning as well is called the angle exit drill. And if you remember, I said there are several areas we work on in the water in order to establish standards. We do cheating singles to establish standards for entries. This drill is designed to set a standard for exits. Every watermark has an entry component and an exit component. Almost every watermark has a swim component. And what we have to do is make sure the dog understands the standards for all three of those elements. So in this drill, let's talk a little bit about the venue you want. You want a relatively straight shoreline that the bank drops off of pretty quickly under the water, meaning as the dog approaches the shoreline, you really don't want them to get their feet on the bottom until they're at the shoreline. So look for a spot like that. That's number one. So we'll have a straight shoreline. And so this is this fairly steep bank here. You also want to make sure that the venue you pick has the wind blowing into the shore. You cannot do this drill unless the wind is blowing into the shore. Because what you're teaching the dog to do is not give in to the pull of the land factor. The land factor is a draw. At the same time that you're doing that, teaching the dog not to be drawn into the land, you want to teach them to fight the wind factor as well. That factor is probably the most powerful factor that affects dogs when they're running tests, is the wind factor. So you wouldn't want to do this drill if the wind was blowing off the shore. All right, so once you have selected your venue, then you're going to pick 3 spots along that shoreline to throw a mark to. The first one should be about 25 to 30 yards in terms of the distance of the swim. I'm just going to put a couple out here. I'm not going to put all 3. So we'll say that this swim here might be 25 to 30 yards to start. Probably closer to 25. And the angle across that corner is about 45 degrees. I pre-marked these spots where, these 1, 2, and the 3rd spot, I pre-marked them with a ribbon so that I place that retrieve precisely in the same spot every time we do it, because we're going to be repeating this mark. Every time the dog fails to meet the standard, we're going to repeat it until the dog does the standard correctly, meets the standard, and then we're going to increase the level of difficulty by moving to the next mark. So this would be mark number 1, this would be mark number 2. An untrained dog is going to want to square out of the pond early. A trained or disciplined dog is going to fight the pull of the shoreline factor and angle to the retrieve. That's the standard we're trying to set. Every time the dog fails to meet the standard, all we're going to do is stop and handle the dog down the shore. We may include indirect pressure corrections as well, and I'll explain that more. Let's talk a little bit about when it's the right time to deal with the land grab. Erase this. So if this is the line to the retrieve and the dog gets in and immediately starts to pull to the shore, that's not the right time to handle. We're going to allow things to develop a little further. You want to wait until the dog is about 5 yards from the shoreline, and that's where you're going to blow your whistle. The reason why we do that is we want to give the dog more context in terms of what they need to do. If we stop the dog and handle them here, we're not really sure whether or not the dog has enough context to understand that we're asking them to swim down the shore. But if we stop them here and give them a cast, now there's more context because the shoreline is right there for the dog to understand what they actually need to do to accomplish the task correctly or meet the standard. And eventually what's going to happen is that line is going to straighten out and they're going to swim all the way to the retrieve. The dog, you know, the first time I run a dog, I typically show the dog how to do it right. I'm not going to use much correction, if any correction at all. Simply going to be stop and cast, stop, use some attrition and cast. I want to show the dog what the standard is they need to meet, and I'll do what I need to do to get there. I'll beg them to do it, so to speak. But once I've shown them the standard, then I'm going to say that if you don't meet the standard, there may be a consequence for not meeting the standard. And so if the dog repeats the same thing, I'm going to stop the dog. 1, remember, we always stop the dog first. 2, once the dog is stopped and looking at us, we're going to make an indirect pressure correction. So we blow, whistle, and correct. And then 3, we handle the dog. Okay. So when I begin this drill, I like to keep it simple. I would like to place the bumper right at the edge of the water so that the dog can see the target the whole way. I want there to be clarity. That's the destination. That's where the retrieve is. That's where you need to swim to. Not trying to make this difficult at this point. And so if the dog does get stopped and handled, there's enough context there, again, for the dog to hopefully meet the standard and understand what we're trying to teach it to do. Once the dog is able to do this with visible bumpers, then I'll put the bumper up on the levee so that it's not visible anymore. The other detail I'd like to mention is I always pre-place a bumper at the ribbon. And the reason why I do that is because if you get a bad bounce, and let's say you're running on a levee, like a lot of times I'll run on a levee, not this high, but a levee like this that's kind of narrow, and you'll get a bad bounce and that bumper will roll off behind the levee, or it'll skip and pop, 6 or 8 yards further. I want to make sure that there's a bumper there for the dog to retrieve at that ribbon when it gets out of the water in the right spot. So again, there's no confusion about what we're trying to do. You just need to swim to the retrieve. So either pre-place a bumper at the edge of the water or pre-place a bumper up by the ribbon on the levee where it isn't visible. One last detail about corrections. So the method of addressing a land grab with correction, this is the default method, meaning this is the method you should be using primarily. You always start with this method. But there is an alternate method, and that is if the dog is squaring up and you've stopped and tried a cast, or you've stopped and tried indirect pressure, and the dog simply refused to take the cast, they dug back again, and your second option in terms of addressing the land grab is this. Wait till the dog gets to the shore, up on the shore, then blow a whistle. Once the dog is stopped and looking at you, then call back with a correction. Option 2.
Call back here.
Yes. 1, stop the dog on shore. 2, call back here and simultaneously make a correction. Okay? Once the dog is in the water again, we don't need to call him all the way back. We just need to call him back into the water so that he's 4 or 5 yards off the shore. And then give the dog the cast again. And essentially what you're doing is, you're making this the hot stove, right? Hot stove. Don't touch the hot stove, you're going to get burned. But this is I would say it's sort of a last resort method of correction. If I'm finding the default method of correction is not effective, then I'm going to switch to the optional method. This is the last detail. Let's say you do handle your dog and they decide to swim down the shore, but they swim past the retrieve. Or they get out a little past the retrieve and keep going. You are not to do anything. This person here, the thrower, is going to fix that situation. Remember, it's just like when we handle on marks. We don't want these dogs to misunderstand that we're handling them away from the destination. We simply want to teach them that they must swim down the shore. It's that person's job to remind the dog when it's necessary that you're still doing this retrieve. I don't want to get involved. Besides which, if you stop the dog and handle them back toward the shore, now you're sending mixed messages. Do I need to swim down the shore, or do I need to just get out of the pond when I feel like it? So if this situation happens, I let it go for a minute. I don't react right away. If the dog is here and it looks like they're swimming this way, I'm going to let it develop some more, because at some point they might just hook in and get the retrieve. But if it looks as though they're just going to keep going, then I'm going to get on the radio and say, Charlie, can you give the dog a hey, hey? Get the dog's attention, get the dog feeling comfortable getting out there to get the retrieve. Remind the dog that they're still working on the retrieve.